This section explains who we are by turning 3 findings from cognitive science against the classical philosophies of the person. The 3 findings are that the mind is embodied, that thought is mostly unconscious, and that abstract concepts are largely metaphorical. They are empirical results, but here they function as a demolition instrument. Each classical person is a fixed point of assumptions that those findings falsify. The Cartesian person assumes self-knowledge by reflection. The Kantian person assumes transcendent autonomous reason. The utilitarian person assumes a conscious utility, maximizer. Then come the Frege, the computational, and the Chomskyan persons in turn. Lakoff and Johnson kill each of them by the same move, and that move is the generative primitive of the whole book. Any philosophy that treats reason as disembodied is making an empirical claim about the mind, and an empirical claim is refutable by cognitive science rather than by argument. A reflexive twist closes the argument. Philosophical questions must themselves be asked with that embodied metaphorical apparatus, so the answers were always metaphorical from the start. The method is not exempt from the finding. This section explains why philosophy's own method fails when its object is the mind itself. Cognitive science has a founding empirical result. Roughly 95% of thought runs below awareness. It is inaccessible in principle, not merely unnoticed. That result turns introspection from a privileged instrument into a dim one, and phenomenology reaches only the pre-reflective shallows, never the machinery underneath. That machinery is the hidden hand. It is an unconscious conceptual system that manufactures the very entities we then take as given. Friendships, bargains, causes, the higher self struggling with the lower self. And it builds them metaphorically. So, metaphysics, the study of what is literally real, inherits its ontology from unconscious metaphor. The chapter's function in the arc is to license the whole project. Either philosophy becomes an empirical science of its own conceptual substrate, or it stays a report on what its instrument cannot see. This section explains the embodied mind. Reason does not sit above the body, using it as an instrument. It runs on the same circuitry. Lakoff's move is to convert a vague question into a testable one. Does conceptual inference reuse the neural architecture of perception and movement? His answer is yes. Color carries the compression. It is interactional, jointly produced by reflectance, light, cones, and circuitry, neither sitting out there in the world nor invented by us. Then comes the generalization that does the philosophical damage. Color is only the tip of the iceberg. Locke's perceiver-dependent secondary qualities swallow the primary ones entirely, leaving nothing in the world to correspond to. What survives is embodied realism, real but body-indexed. Once the sensory-motor system is the locus of inference, disembodied reason has no place left to live. This section explains how metaphor builds subjective experience. Metaphor is what makes subjective experience thinkable at all. It is the very machinery of thought, not an ornament laid over an already formed idea. Take a domain your body computes richly: verticality, warmth, proximity, seeing. Set beside it a domain your mind judges only thinly: quantity, affection, similarity, knowing. In infancy, the two fire together, as when water rises while you pour more, and that coactivation forges permanent cross-domain neural connections. Octoid inference flows one way only, from the richer sensory-motor network into the poorer subjective one. You reason about more with the machinery evolved for up. The asymmetry follows from inferential capacity rather than convention, which is why too much never means too high. Bare subjective concepts stay literal but skeletal. Hundreds of these primary metaphors are acquired unchosen simply from having this body in this world. This section explains how complex metaphors are built out of simpler ones. The thesis is chemical in the strict sense. Primary metaphors are atoms, and everyday complex metaphors, like a purposeful life is a journey, are molecules assembled from those atoms plus a cultural folk model that supplies the binding premise. Nothing new is invented at the molecular level. The mapping is entailed by the parts and the way they lock together. That is why the resulting metaphors are stable, entrenched, and shared across a culture for centuries, and why they can be derived rather than merely catalogued. The chapter's function in the arc of the book is to close the compositionality gap left by Chapter 4. Primary metaphors are motivated by bodily experience, and complex ones by composition. The lesson is grammar, not lexicon. This section explains how the chapter inverts who audits whom. First-generation cognitive science inherited its picture of mind from analytic philosophy before looking at any data. That inherited picture was disembodied function, meaningless embodied, function, meaningless symbols, classical categories, and literal meaning. So its so-called results were only the assumptions returning an empirical costume. Second-generation cognitive science refuses that inheritance. What it substitutes works at the level of method rather than doctrine. 3 commitments: cognitive reality, convergent evidence, and maximal generalization, which constrain the search without fixing the answer. That asymmetry is the whole argument. Assumptions which cannot predict their own output are legitimate. Assumptions which can predict their own output are philosophy smuggled in. Prototypes, image schemas, and conceptual metaphor emerged unanticipated from 9 converging evidence streams. That is the mark of a finding rather than a premise. This section explains what realism is a claim about once the gap between mind and world is refused. Realism claims a fit between organism and environment. The rival picture, a fit between symbol and world, is the one embodied realism sets aside. The Greeks had no gap to bridge because mind touched being directly. Descartes opened one, and every technical repair since has widened it. Propositions split one gap into 2. Set theoretic models split it into 3. No account bridges any of them. The diagnosis is structural. The correspondence theory's difficulty is generated, not left unsolved. The disembodiment premise creates the chasm it then tries to span. Embodied realism keeps the world's existence and the absence of a mind-body gap. It surrenders only absolute knowledge of things in themselves. That is the one aspect never needed for surviving, functioning, and flourishing. This section explains the relationship between metaphor and truth. Truth was never the property metaphor lacked. Irrelevance to truth was the property philosophy had to assign it, to keep the folk theory of language safe. 2.5 millennia of treating metaphor as a matter of words, of deviance, of dead residue, and of pre-existing similarity form. 4 theorems and a corollary of a single axiom. That axiom holds that concepts are literal and fit the world as it is. Aristotle and Searle keep the axiom by reducing metaphor to indirect, literal statement. Nietzsche and Derrida keep it by letting metaphor dissolve truth claims. Opposed schools, identical commitment. Once metaphor is shown to be conceptual, a cross-domain mapping, asymmetric and inference projecting, the axiom fails, and with it, correspondence truth. What replaces it is embodied truth. The chapter's stake is that eliminating metaphor would eliminate philosophy. This section explains how the cognitive science of philosophical ideas inverts philosophy's usual object. Instead of asking what time is, it asks what the philosopher's conceptual system had to be for the question to mean anything at all. The move is transcendental in structure, but empirical in method. The conditions of possibility of a philosophical question turn out to be facts about a cognitive unconscious, and facts of that kind can be falsified. Part 2 runs this on the 6 central ideas the book rests on: events, causation, time, self, mind, and morality. Each one resolves into a thin, non-metaphorical skeleton, fleshed out by many inconsistent conventional metaphors. The result is a patchwork, many loosely joined pieces, never a single monolith. Where the analytic philosopher gives necessary and sufficient conditions, the cognitive linguist collects every causal expression across the world's languages and generalizes. Part 3 turns the same instrument on the philosophers themselves. This section explains why time, the most metaphysically loaded concept available, turns out to carry no content of its own. Time has no perceptual organ. Motion does, a dedicated visual area, so cognition inverts physics. Motion is primary, and time is derived from it. What stays literal in the concept is a metonymy. Iterated events of one kind stand in for intervals, and time inherits its directionality, its continuity, its segmentability, and its measurability from events, rather than from anything of its own. Everything past that point is metaphor, with space as the source. The chapter's move within the book's arc is to take the most metaphysically loaded concept available and show that it carries no self-standing content. Asking what time is in itself becomes asking whose metaphor's metaphysics you inherited. The Aymara case, where the past sits in front and the future behind, marks the contingency of that mapping. This section explains why causation resists a single definition and what holds it together instead. Causation is a radial category. Its center is the body's experience of forced motion, a hand moving an object. Its periphery is metaphorical extension outward from that center. That single move dissolves both puzzles the chapter opens with. The first is the causal concept puzzle. Why do domino logic, threshold logic, and plate tectonic logic all count as causal when their inferences contradict each other? The second is the causal theory puzzle. Why do Aristotle, Hume, and Collingwood count as theorists of the same subject? The answer to both is that they share a skeletal prototype rather than a definition. Philosophy's search for the literal logic of causation was a search for the common core of a family. But the family has a common source instead. This section explains how our concept of the mind is built from metaphors imported from the body. No serious statement about thought avoids importing its structure from elsewhere, and the elsewhere is the body. Sweetzer's mind. As body subsystem branches into 4 physical functionings: moving, perceiving, manipulating, and eating. So, ideas become locations, sights, graspable objects, and food, and each branch drags its own entailments along with it. Thought as language and thought as mathematical calculation sit alongside these, mutually inconsistent. Here is the philosophical payoff. What present themselves as competing theories of mind, the Phrygian intentions, the symbol manipulation homunculus, are these folk metaphors taken literally, one branch elevated and its rival suppressed? This is the same move already, run on time, causation, and events, here turned on the faculty doing the running. This section explains what the self really is, a single schema wearing different clothes. Every way you can speak of your own interior turns out to be that one schema. A person split into a subject, the locus of consciousness, reason, and will, always conceptualized as person-like, and one or more selves, carrying the body, the social roles, the past. Nothing literal underwrites the split. It is projected from 4 childhood correlations: controlling objects, being in your normal place, being evaluated by others, and imagining yourself as another. To those 4, add the folk theory of essences. The projections contradict each other. Consider 2 sentences. I was disappointed in myself, and I disappointed myself. They place the standard setter on opposite sides. Japanese we and zibun reproduce the same system. The generator is embodiment. Culture does not produce it. This part explains where moral concepts come from and why they inherit their shape from the body. Morality inherits its inference from the body. A short list: health, wealth, strength, purity, uprightness, nurturance, light, supplies every source domain, and each abstract moral concept is a metaphorical projection off one of them, carrying the source's own logic across. Morale accounting makes justice a balanced ledger, harm a debt, retribution its collection. The arithmetic of bookkeeping becomes the list is short because well-being is short, the small set of things people everywhere took to sustain them, where 2 metaphors conflict, moral strength against moral empathy. A family model ranks them either the strict father or the nurturant parent. From this, the chapter's cut follows. Principles drawn from well-being domains can never precede the good, so deontology loses its footing. This section explains how cognitive science can be turned on philosophy itself. Philosophy has no privileged tools. The chapter's move is to turn cognitive science on philosophy itself, treating it as ordinary conceptual activity. Take Locke. His mind is a container, with sense conduits feeding into it, and a homunculus builder working into it, and a homunculus builder working inside. You understand him instantly, because you already carry those same metaphors. You might take these metaphors for mere decoration. They are not. The metaphors define the ontology, and the doctrine's logic is the entailment structure of the metaphors. So the chapter opens the method of part 3. You analyze a philosopher by recovering the minimal set of folk theories and mappings that make his metaphysics inevitable. The inversion lands lost. Far from being an impediment to rationality, metaphor is its very condition of possibility. This section explains where metaphysics comes from, treating it as something the mind constructs rather than something it finds in the world. Metaphysics is generated. The categories it presents as discoveries are the output of a cognitive move. That move composes 4 folk theories: intelligibility, general kinds, essences, and the all-inclusive category. Run together, they iterate one step. Everything is a kind. Every kind has an essence. Kinds nest upward. So the top cat has an essence. That top essence is called being, and it exists only as the output of that composition. Nothing else grounds it. The Milesians then fill it by a schema. The essence of being is X, where X is whatever they already understand better. For Thales, that X is water. For Anaximenes, it is air, condensing and rarefying. Because essence in ordinary cases means substance, form, or pattern of change, those become the only three answers available. The space of possible fillings is fixed in advance by what essence already meant. Taking the metaphor literally is what founded Western metaphysics. Refusing the four folk theories turns the problem of being into a pseudo-problem. This section explains how Plato's whole metaphysics unfolds from a small handful of ordinary metaphors. That deduction is the chapter's move. The metaphysics is a short chain of consequences drawn out of everyday ways of speaking. Take three everyday metaphors. Knowing is seeing, ideas are objects, and existence is location here. Now add two that Plato invented deliberately. Essences are ideas and essences are ideals. From just these five, the forms, the realm of becoming, the virtue ethics, the idea of the good, and the cave all fall out as entailments. Nothing mystical is being posited. The metaphor's own logic forces each result, including the strange ones. Opinion needs an object that neither is nor is not. Cowardice can have no essence, since ideals must be good. So what looks like the discovered structure of reality is the inherited structure of embodied metaphor. This section explains how a single metaphor generates the whole of Aristotle's philosophy. One metaphor does the generating, ideas are essences. Grant that metaphor, together with the folk theories of intelligibility, general kinds, essences, and the all-inclusive category, and everything follows without any further invention. From there, the categories arrive as the top subdivisions of being, definition arrives as a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, and the syllogism arrives as a causal engine. The acorn's telos sits objectively in the world, because purposes are ideas, ideas are essences, and essences are out there. Lakoff's move in the chapter is to run the derivation forward and show the ontology arriving as a consequence of the metaphor rather than of observation. What Aristotle bequeathed as the structure of being was the structure of a conceptual mapping taken literally. This section explains how Descartes' picture of the mind is built entirely from ordinary embodied metaphors. Strip those metaphors away, and Descartes' mind vanishes entirely. The chapter makes a single move. The Enlightenment picture of mind, disembodied, transparent to itself, absolutely certain, its thought as formal as mathematics, arises the moment ordinary embodied metaphors are followed out to their entailments. The metaphor, knowing is seeing, installs what the chapter calls the Cartesian theater. Idea. Objects lit by the natural light of reason, watched by an inner spectator that Descartes names intuition. Certainty is then just clear vision made into a thing. Here is the surprise that indicts the whole tradition. The mind declaring itself severed from body is authored by the body's most basic metaphors. Its disembodiment is a metaphorical artifact, something that constitutes the theory itself, woven into its very structure rather than added to decorate it. This section explains why Kant is the strongest possible test case, chosen where the book should break and made to confirm it instead. Kant is the philosopher who insisted morality descends from pure, disembodied, universal reason, the exact antithesis of an embodied mind. Lakoff and Johnson take that claim and dissect it into metaphors. Moral law is modeled on physical law. The self is split into a governing reason, ruling a governed body of desire. The whole apparatus is a folk, strict father morality projected onto the cosmos. The move is a fortiori. If even Kant's transcendent reason runs on bodily metaphor, no ethics escapes it. The purest denial of embodiment becomes the sharpest demonstration that abstract philosophy is built from the same unconscious metaphor as everything else. This section explains how analytic philosophy is generated by the very thing it claims to reject. A discipline that defines itself as the rigorous, metaphor-free analysis of language turns out to be generated by a single, unnoticed metaphor. Thought as language, plus two nursery folk theories, naming and meaning. Fix those, and every tenet unfolds mechanically. Meaning becomes an objective word, world relation. Truth becomes correspondence, and all meaning is literal and disembodied. Frege seeds the error, the claim that shared, public meaning must be disembodied, with imagination and feeling being merely private. The chapter turns the book's own instrument inward, name the hidden metaphor, then derive the doctrine. The irony carries the whole weight. The philosophy that most fiercely denies embodiment is itself the output of an embodied metaphor its practitioners never see. This depends on the mind metaphors from Chapter 12. This section makes a single charge against Chomsky. A theory presented as empirical discovery is really an a priori philosophy wearing empirical clothes. That is the chapter's one move. The generative substitution is this. Language takes the seat Descartes reserved for reason. Once language is the rational essence that defines the human, every Chomskyan tenet follows by inheritance rather than by evidence. Language becomes autonomous, universal, innate, mathematical, and therefore purely formal, studiable by introspection alone. Needing no brain and no body, will you have die? The famous requirement that syntax be independent of semantics is a definition, borrowed from post-formal languages, dressed as an empirical finding. Read Chomsky's premises and you can already predict his results. That is the mark of philosophy determining the empirics in advance. This section explains how the chapter takes the book's whole thesis about embodied reason and turns it into a weapon aimed at one target, the rational actor model. The move is a separation. Pull the pure game theory mathematics apart from its interpretation, and what claimed to describe rationality is exposed as three stacked metaphors doing the describing. Actions become paths, the event, structure metaphor. Desirability becomes money, the metaphor that well-being is wealth. The mathematics alone says nothing. The metaphors smuggle in a hidden moral worldview. Classical rationality's fifth tenet, dispassion, is simply false. Damasio's book, Descartes' Error, shows that emotion is necessary to means and reason. So the model is a human imposition, valid only where its own metaphors quietly hold. This part explains what a philosophical theory really is at the level of its structure. A philosophy is what its handful of core metaphors do. Take any theory as an object of study, and its unity dissolves into a small set of shared containers, the same folk mappings everyone reasons with. Each one projects a source domain's ontology onto an abstract target, and that projection is the metaphysics itself. Two examples: being is number, and categories are contained. Coherence comes from the metaphors, from embodied imaginative structure. It does not come from pure reason inspecting itself, because embodied reason cannot know itself directly. The surprise runs anti-deflationary. Naming the metaphors does not debunk a theory. It locates the theory's explanatory power. Philosophers are poets of systematic thought, extending shared imaginative structures into new terrain. A theory feels intuitive exactly when its metaphors are ones the culture already lives by. This section explains where abstract reason actually comes from. Reason is the very sensory motor machinery of perception and movement, run again on abstract material rather than a transcendent faculty that the flesh merely houses. Lakoff's three findings collapse into one generative move. Those findings are that the mind is embodied, that thought is mostly unconscious, and that abstract concepts are largely metaphorical. The single move underneath all three is this: metaphor is a structure, preserving map from a bodily source domain onto an abstract target, and inference rides the map. Consider the everyday cases. Understanding is grasping, more is up, purposes are destinations. Each of these imports the logic of a body schema wholesale. So the whole of Western philosophy's disembodied reason inverts. Abstraction inherits its structure from embodiment rather than escaping it. The primitive to keep is this: to explain any abstract concept, find the sensory motor schema whose inferences it silently borrows.